Well, thank you for tuning in again to this video channel. My name is Peter Waters, G3OJV, and as a company of Waters and Stanton, over many years we've supported club activities, and in fact we've worked with the RSGB over a good many years to support what is called Club of the Year. Now this is basically a competition between clubs to try and raise their profile, and it's just sort of a friendly competition between clubs, but it does encourage club activity, and of course club activity is a very important part of the amateur radio scene. And I think we've donated something in the order of £30,000 over the years to this particular project. Well, that project has now come to an end, and there's going to be some new organisation activities related to the club and so forth. But during that time, there is one thing during conversations that comes up time and time again, and that is, how do we encourage newcomers into the hobby? And it's something that there's no single answer to it. I think there is one strand which I continually go on about when I have these conversations, and it's a strand that hasn't really been resolved yet, and I think it's quite an important strand. Let me go back to when I started in amateur radio. How did I start? Well, I didn't know anything about amateur radio, never heard of it, didn't know it existed. And then one day, I was a teenager then. When I say a teenager, I was probably about 14 or 15. I went into a newsagent shop in Upminster in Essex, and I found a copy on the shelf of Shortwave magazine. And I browsed through this. It was fascinating that these guys had their own radio stations, and I thought, gosh, that really appeals to me. I mean, I suppose I'd always been a bit technically orientated, so I bought this magazine, took it home, and I think I read it cover to cover, and I just really found it fascinating. There was photos of ham radio operators with their stations and talking to people all over the world. And so I wanted to get involved, and I did two things. I joined my local radio club, and I then purchased a copy of Practical Wallis. And the reason I purchased it was because I wanted a receiver, and I couldn't afford to buy a receiver, so I reckoned that the best option was to build a simple shortwave receiver. Now, in those days it wasn't too difficult. I actually built a 2-valve regenerative detector receiver, which just happened to work on 40 metres, and which happened to be, in those days, and still is to some extent, a very busy band during the daytime. I got it working, and to me that was a great thrill to be able to listen to the stations. Now, Practical Wireless has been going for many years, and in its heyday, I think I'm right in saying that the circulation was probably 50,000, may even be more. And that was in the time when radio was really popular and still evolving. And I then thought, in more recent years, if I hadn't have walked into the newsagent and bought that magazine, I wouldn't have known about amateur radio at all. And now, come up to the present day, how often do you go into a newsagent's and find a copy of a magazine that covers amateur radio? Well, I think you know the answer to that as well as I do. A hobby can only survive if people know about it. And one of the ways that people know about hobbies is through magazines that cover that particular hobby. And that is an area where it's just not being met at all in the case of ham radio. Now let's have a look. The most successful and popular ham radio magazine undoubtedly is Radcom, the RSGB's magazine. It's got a wealth of technical information in there, operational information, and information generally about the licence conditions and about what you can and can't do, and all the latest news. Great. The problem is, of course, that the only way you'll get that magazine is if you're a member of the RSGB. And you're only likely to be a member of the RSGB if you're interested in amateur radio. So it's almost like a catch-22 situation. If you don't know about the hobby, you don't know about the hobby, full stop. I can understand why Radcom is not on the newsstand. The reason is quite simply that a lot of people join the RSGB because of the magazine. Not only the magazine, but that's one of the big reasons they join the RSGB. Put it on the newsstands and the membership of the RSGB would die big time. So it's not likely ever to be on the newsstands. The other magazine that I mentioned about, Shortwave magazine, that really folded a long time ago. There was an attempt to resurrect it, but really and truly, in its original form of being entirely ham radio magazine, when the owner of the magazine sold it out, then that magazine changed to the extent that it didn't really cover amateur radio anymore. Practical Wireless. Now, Practical Wireless is interesting. It was produced alongside a lot of other practical magazines in the 40s, 50s and 60s, and it had the backing of a very large publisher. Now that's key. You need a large publisher because not only will the publisher push the magazine, but it has the clout to get the magazine on the newsstands, on the bookshelves. And these days it's very tough. I think a high proportion of magazines now are sold by the supermarkets, and the supermarkets are very demanding. They're not going to put a magazine on the shelf unless it sells regularly. So in its heyday, Practical Wireless was great. It changed hands. I don't know when it was now, but it changed hands quite a long time ago, and it went into private ownership. And sadly, it didn't really, in my opinion, it didn't really cater for the ham radio operator as such. There was things in there about amateur radio, but it was not anything compared with the likes of Radcom. And so the circulation went down, and when the circulation goes down, a magazine eventually doesn't appear on the bookshelf. And that's exactly what happened. Practical Wireless no longer appeared on the magazine bookshelf. An interesting thing happened 2 or 3 years ago. The private owners of Practical Wallis sold it to a big publisher, and when I say big publisher, they are a big publisher with some very successful titles. And so once again, Practical Wallis found itself in the hands of a publisher who had clout. And we also had a new editor, G3 XTT, Don, who was a very active ham radio operator, done lots of expeditions and so forth, and he still is a very active amateur. And the quality of the magazine has gone up. All we need now is to get the sales up. Now I haven't got a magic wand or and so forth, but if we don't buy it, certainly it's not going to expand. I think we should try and encourage a magazine onto the newsstands. Now, if you don't have a copy of Practical Wireless, you don't get one, then I suggest you do try it out, because it's a much more interesting magazine than it was a few years ago. And I think that that is one of the keys of getting the membership, not the membership, get the following of the hobby up to a level which we all like to see, because there's no doubt about it that as the hobby increases in popularity, and we do need to do that, as it increases in popularity, then it's good for everyone. Practical Wireless have got a promotion on at the moment. So you get 3 magazines for £5, and I'm going to put this up on the screen in a minute. so that you can see what is involved. But 3 magazines for £5 these days is a good deal. I hasten to add that I have no financial connection with Practical Wireless whatsoever. My sole interest in this video is to try and encourage you to perhaps give that magazine a try again, because it has developed into a much better magazine than it has been for many years. And I know for a fact that only half the amateur population are members of the RSGB anyway, so the other half of the amateur radio population haven't even got a magazine they can read, apart from those that are readers of Practical Wireless. One encouraging thing I saw recently, I was in Scotland and I went to Tesco's, a large Tesco's, and I was pleasantly surprised to see Practical Wireless on the bookshelf there in Tesco's. It was in Inverness, but a very large Tesco's, 24-hour Tesco's. So that was very encouraging. And if you want a copy of Practical Wireless, you can get it by mail direct, or you can go to newsagents and order it. Now, that might not be a bad idea, because if you go to a newsagents and order it, it encourages perhaps the newsagent to perhaps put a few copies into stock in coming months. So there we are. That's my thoughts on one of the ways that we can increase the popularity of the hobby. You may not agree with what I say, and that's fine. If you feel you want to chime in and put some comments at the bottom of this video, that's fine by me. If you think that's what I've said is wrong, okay, tell me so. If you think it's a good idea, tell me so. But from my point of view, I think that we desperately need an amateur radio magazine on the bookshelves in the newsagents. End of video. So there we are. I hope that's been thought-provoking. And as usual, if you find these videos of interest, then please press subscribe. And as usual, until the next time, enjoy your ham radio.